You've likely seen this photo many times before. It was taken in 1994 and shows Palestinian President Yasser Arafat shaking hands with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. This photo symbolized a kind of hope and the prospect for a road to peace. But 3 decades later, and this photo and that prospect seem further away than ever before. The election of the most right-wing coalition in recent memory has given rise to a new group of ultra-nationalist and extreme religious Zionist figures who have helped return Benjamin Netanyahu to power and demand a future for Israel free from Palestinians. In the West Bank, the killing of dozens of Palestinian citizens at the hands of Israeli soldiers this year and the devastating bombing campaign in Gaza last year has spurned an armed insurrection, spilling over into violent attacks in Jerusalem and Israeli cities. Daniel Levy is a former Israeli peace negotiator and played a key role in the Oslo Accords, where this photo was taken. Levy is now the president of the US Middle East Project and the former head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Let's take a look at the big picture. So Daniel Levy, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Nice to be here.
I really want to talk to you about what's happening in Israel right now. After these Israeli elections, they're the fifth that we've had in the last couple of years. It's come at the end of an extreme sense of turmoil in Israeli politics and Israeli society, and out from it has emerged this far right that seems new to Israeli politics. We've also seen the reemergence, the almost victorious, triumphant reemergence of Benjamin Netanyahu after his own personal and political turmoil. How do you see what's happening in Israel right now?
Going into this election, it was very clear that you had a relatively coherent, cohesive bloc on one side backing Netanyahu. It's the Likud, two ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, and this religious Zionist party, which I imagine we'll go into a little more in our conversation, led by these characters, Smotrich and Gvir. On the other side, you had this mishmash, hodgepodge collection of political actors who had been the forces that came together to produce the coalition led by Bennett, Lapid, Gantz. And while they managed to form a coalition, they only managed to hold together for a year before that fell apart. They did not offer an alternative. They went into this election with elements saying, we will not go into government with you again. The Gantz party ruled out, and they used this language, ruled out a coalition with the Arabs this time around. So what you have is relative cohesion, 64 out of 120 seats. It's taken, as you said, Mohammed, 5 rounds of elections to get to this point of clarity. What it's important to understand is while you have 64 inside the coalition, the clear ideological right has more representation than that in the Knesset. It's represented deep into the other side, 75 plus, I would say, of the 120 seats. And what's more, there was so little change for the better, if you're looking at this from the perspective of an inclusive democracy, if you're looking at this from the perspective of respect for human rights, changing positions with regard to the treatment of Palestinians. There was so little / no improvement during the Lapid-Bennett-Gantz government that the Netanyahu coalition in many respects can simply pick up where the others left off, because in so many spheres this was a government of continuity to Netanyahu anyway. And so while it would be a mistake to pretend things won't get worse, they will get worse, primarily for Palestinians. Israeli defenders of human rights, Israeli Jewish defenders of human rights will also, I think, have a very hard time ahead of them. So it would be churlish not to acknowledge the extremism. But it would also be analytically mistaken to ignore the fact that it was the Lapid-Bennett government which just continued, whether it's the settlements, and some things actually got worse, deteriorated. They went after the Palestinian civil society sector, human rights defenders, NGOs, in ways that Netanyahu had not in the past. They qualitatively increased the daily arrests, incursions, military operations deep inside nominally PA-controlled territories, which is something we might get onto. They resumed something that had been suspended for a number of years, which is a policy of extrajudicial assassinations. So, yes, hard times ahead with this coalition, but it's a spectrum here. And Lapid has served with Bibi in the past. So, that lack of a real alternative is also a factor that needs to be acknowledged.
And what you mentioned about this continuation of a lot of policies, we definitely saw that in the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, the normalization of Israeli control over areas like Hebron and other parts, and the U-turn of a lot of initial policies that were put in place once that coalition government first came into power. Last year we saw the bombing campaign in Gaza, which was a very Netanyahu style campaign just before an election. Why is it that this coalition that was supposed to provide an alternative, a really clear alternative, and a really marked end to the era of Netanyahu's politics, why did it fail to do so?
The Bennett-Lapid government did not promise a change on the fundamental question of Israel as a rights-respecting democracy versus Israel as an ethno-nationalist democracy. And it's not surprising that that's the case, given that the Prime Minister who headed that government until its collapse, Naftali Bennett, himself has a history of racist positions and comments vis-a-vis Palestinian Arabs. He's a supporter of annexation. He has one of the most hardline parties. His number two, Ayelet Shaked, has a history of really quite vile, abusive, discriminatory comments against Palestinian Arabs. His coalition partners included Benny Gantz, who led his first campaign in politics, priding himself on the destruction and human rights violations, he didn't call it that, of course, that he wrought in Gaza as head of the Israeli military. And a coalition ally was Avigdor Lieberman. And the story of Avigdor Lieberman is important. He will now become a largely forgotten sectoral politician of the Russian-speaking immigrant community. But Lieberman came into politics as an independent actor when he left the Likud. He's a former Likud guy. Much of the centre-right is populated, and much of the centre is populated by people who've come out of the Likud party. Lieberman's claim to fame is the loyalty oath. His first successful independent election campaign is no loyalty, no citizenship. That was the slogan. And I draw that historical recollection out because of what it tells us about this new form, new in inverted commas, I think, of extremism, Smotrich and Gvir. What we have seen consistently is the ability of the Israeli body politic to absorb its most extreme elements, recalibrate its center of gravity ever further towards this intolerant ethno-nationalist right, and then move on and absorb the next extremist. And the absorption of Lieberman was an important marker point in that history. You could contrast it with what happened to the Kahanists, the forerunners of Ben Gvir's Jewish Power Party. No one would form a coalition with them. They were then declared illegal. They were then removed from politics. That's not what's happened now. And I think the crucial thing to draw out here is that, yes, you can go back to Israeli history, you can go back to the pre-state history, and look at the Nakba, look at the expulsion, look at the military regime of control that was imposed on those Palestinian Arabs who remained behind, who found themselves in the state of Israel once it's declared, once the war is over. They lived under a military regime from 48 to 66. You then look at the history post-67 of the occupation. You can look at that and draw the conclusion that this was never going to be a successful marrying of the idea of a Jewish state and a democratic state. The Jewish trumped the democratic. I think that's part of the story. But I think there's a part of the story which is how over time the tension in those terms was resolved increasingly in favor of the Jewish. That perhaps there was not an inevitability there, but the lived experience of the Jewish democratic state, looked at from the vantage point of 2022, is that if there were moments where democratic could have gained the upper hand, it didn't happen. And now, and this is why I think it is newish territory. Now we are in the triumph of the Jewish supremacist space unequivocally over the democratic space. And that is how come you can have the absorption almost unquestioned amongst the Likud and going far deeper of the religious Zionist party in its modern incarnation into the Israeli body politic. And you actually now have mainstream Israeli journalists saying this is Jewish supremacism, saying this is ethno-nationalism, which is important. And one can be justifiably cynical and say, oh, good morning, you wake up, smell the coffee. We've known this for however long. But one can also be strategically smart and say, okay, let's pull on that thread and let's see where it takes us in terms of opening people's eyes to this reality and what can unravel as a consequence of the transparent Jewish over democratic agenda. It's a demographic agenda.
כולם מבקשים שינוי אמיתי. מבקשים ללכת בביטחון ברחוב. מבקשים שלא יכבלו את הידיים של החיילים והשוטרים שלנו. מבקשים לעשות הפרדה מוחלטת בין מי שנאמן למדינת ישראל ואין לנו שום בעיה איתו, לבין מי שחותר תחת קיומה של המדינה היקרה שלנו.
And speaking of demographics in particular, I think it's been one of the really interesting shifts in Israeli society and Israeli politics over the last couple of years. And, you know, for example, there was a Pew poll that came out a couple of years ago that said, or 2 years ago, that where, you know, 2/3 of young Israelis identified as being right-wing, and half of all Israelis were sympathetic, at the very least, with the idea of the loyalty oath policies, the idea that if Palestinians weren't loyal to the idea of a Jewish state, then that they shouldn't be Palestinian citizens. And how much of that is down to the actual population shift that's happened within Israeli societies between Israeli cities and the growing number of, I think more than 500,000 now Israeli settlers who are active participants in Israeli politics, who, Naftali Bennett was the first so-called settler prime minister. And, now you have Ben Gvir and you have Smotrich himself, somebody that still lives in a settlement, still advocates very much his entire politics is painted and colored by Israeli settler issues. How much of that is responsible for this wave now that we're seeing of far-right politics?
There's different demographic trends at play, and there's different political trends at play, and what you've highlighted is part of that. It is undoubtedly important in understanding contemporary Israeli social, political dynamics that you have such a large population in the settlements. But that's not the only part of the story, obviously. It matters that you've had hardline ideologues in charge of the education ministry for most of the last decade and a half at least. It matters that decades of dehumanizing Palestinians, you can't occupy people. I mean, the famous Israeli Jewish philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovitz pointed this out right at the beginning. You can't occupy people, deny them their most basic rights for so many years. This is the 6th decade of the occupation. Send your kids to be soldiers patrolling that occupation, managing, staffing, checkpoints, incursions. If one looks at the material that the Breaking the Silence organization puts out, you can't get your kids to do that unless they're uniquely terrible kids, and I don't think that's the truth of Israeli kids are not uniquely terrible. They are in a system which can only work if it successfully dehumanizes the people you are treating in this way, the people whose basic rights and freedoms you are denying every day. And that's so deep now. That has worked. Generations of kids have gone through that. When Palestinians resist, it's terrorism. It's incitement. Now, the specific wave that Ben Gvir and Smotrich have surfed, although the mental image of Ben Gvir and Smotrich surfing that just came up in my head is one that I will try and banish immediately.
Thank you. Now I have that
exactly. But the way that they've surfed is, don't feel guilty, feel proud. We are doing the right thing. And after the events of May 21, where as Palestinians depict it, the Unity Intifada, not only in the occupied territories, but inside Israel, in the Palestinian community inside Israel. After that, it was, we've got to show who's the boss here. That was his message. So that's a huge piece of this. And without that, you wouldn't, without that decades-long dehumanization, and if you're dehumanizing one side, you're over-humanizing another side. That's where ethno-nationalism, supremacism is a legal structure, but it's also an ideational, conceptual framework that people live in, often subconsciously, sometimes really not subconsciously. There's nothing subconscious about the messaging of Smotrich and Ben Gvir. Then there are other demographics which are important, like the growth of the ultra-Orthodox Haredi population. So the increase in their representation is basically a function that they have more kids. And that community has undergone a radicalization process. I mean, one of the things that you have to factor in this new government, 64 members, split evenly between the Likud and its coalition allies. The coalition allies are all of a religious disposition, religious nationalist or ultra-Orthodox disposition. Likud itself increasingly looks that way as well. So whereas a couple of years ago, in one of the multiple iterations of election outcomes, there was an argument in the Likud, we can't go into government with these guys. This time around, Bibi, in the most premeditated, conscious act, he pulls the religious Zionist party together. The merger happens in his home in Caesarea. No one in the Likud is questioning. No one in the Likud is questioning the legitimacy of having them in government, and everyone will be looking over their shoulders because no one believes that the 14 seats that the religious Zionist party received in this election is the ceiling. If one were to be a bit generous, one could look at a period in Israeli political history as being something of a struggle between, and maybe it's 80s, 90s, early noughties, a struggle between a camp that said, look, we're going to have to come to terms with the Palestinians. Is it a state? Is it a state minus? Is it unilateral disengagement? Is it something that's very clearly not a state, but at least we're not in daily control? We can still manage many aspects of their lives, security, etc. But an element of that contains a separationist component, versus those who said, listen, we're managing this, we've got it, we can entrench our control without giving up anything, and gradualism works. I think the center of gravity of the Israeli political debate today is between the continuity of that second camp that I mentioned, ever more settlements, ever more control, matrix of entrenched Israeli presence, continuously downgrading Palestinian expectations, global support. You know, we have a front where we try and crush UNRWA, we have a front where we try and crush any prospect of international accountability of BDS, etc. That camp versus the camp that says incrementalism isn't delivering for us. We've won. You don't have to pay lip service to anyone. We've got normalization with the Arab world. We've got fabulous relations across much of the world. We had an American administration that was willing to do anything. What are we waiting for? The victory now camp. The Palestinian Authority may be totally co-opted, but it is still the receptacle of some notion of future Palestinian self-determination. Crush the whole thing. And, you know, one way of looking at this is Israel's territorial victory has not been translated into a demographic victory. As long as Palestinians are still on the ground, this is not over. And so the logic of that position is an expulsionist logic. And what's quite terrifying is the increasing appearance of expulsionist transfer Nakba 2 rhetoric in Israeli political utterances, whether it's Smotrich, whether it's people in the Likud, and you hear it now in ways that was much rarer. And people are working on documenting this. It's premature to share, but it's palpable.
There was a piece this week that came out from Meron Rapaport, the Israeli journalist and analyst. And what he was saying was that Netanyahu really kind of, during his term, mastered the craft of never really having to talk about Palestinians, where he was pushing this kind of status quo. He was pushing the situation as it was, even diplomatically, internationally, as much as possible, never having to really kind of address the Palestinian issue, the occupation issue. Now he has coalition partners, and all they want to talk about is Palestinians, almost at an obsessive level. What has changed? What these people, a couple of years ago were seen, even in Israel, as right-wing agitators people that weren't to be taken seriously. Even when Smotrich came into the Knesset, he was kind of an outlier. He was this weird figure that said crazy things. And now Smotrich and Ben Gvir are trying to really pushing for the most powerful positions in the government. They're widely seen as two of the most influential people in the entire country. And they really want to have this conversation about demographics, about ethnicity, about Palestinians, citizenships, and about Palestinians in general. Is this mirroring something happening in Israeli society? Is there an acceptance now for this kind of language that wasn't there a couple of years ago?
So I think to do this justice, let's start with de-exceptionalizing Israel, and then we'll go back to the specifics of what goes on over there. The de-exceptionalization piece is the political environment we live in a social media, relentless news cycle, destructive echo chambers context of the contemporary world. And so it's not a phenomenon unique to Israel. The emergence of a Ben Gvir type figure who is irresistible to the media. So you've got a lot of mea culpa stuff happening in the Israeli media right now. We built him, but he's irresistible. He has viewage. So that's something that's not unique. Put that on the overlay of the Israeli reality, which is a bit different. Why is it different? It's different because, unlike in other political spaces, this is going on where you have a whole people under occupation who don't have the right to vote. They have theoretically the right to vote for a largely non-existent, irrelevant entity, the Palestinian Authority, which has not had elections for 16 years anyway, but is funded, blessed, kept in power by Israel and the West. But it means that you don't have to appeal to that constituency at all those disenfranchised Palestinians. One may be unsatisfied with some of what's offered as the alternative to contemporary right politics in many Western political spaces, but at least it's identifiable as an alternative on the key issues of the day. In Israel, that's not the case. It's what we spoke about earlier. Lapid and Gantz are not an alternative. They don't challenge. If the key thing there is, are we going to be an ethno-nationalist state or a democratic state? They have nothing to say on that question. Continuity, status quo. So I think that gives you the backdrop as to the incorporation, the absorption of these elements into the Israeli body politic. Will there be overreach? I mean, I think one of the questions that flows from that is, do these guys basically make the thing ungovernable? Is Bibi just not going to be able to manage this? Are they looking for the first opportunity to embarrass and test this theory of 14 not being the ceiling? We can go much higher. And we don't know. We literally do not know. It seems that they're pretty effective politicians and that they will factor that stuff in. People don't want an election yet again. It's taken 5 rounds, etc. This could not have happened if Israel were not were Israel not accorded a unique level of impunity internationally. US policy, Western policy, is the handmaiden to that apartheid reality described by those organizations, is the handmaiden to the emergence and now the bedding down of Smotrich Ben Gvir. Because the Israeli public can almost uniquely go to the polling booth, safe in the knowledge that there are no costs and consequences to however extreme they're going to get, to whatever they're going to do to Palestinians, because America is the guarantor of that. And in the context of all the verbiage, all the preaching, all the moral high horse we've seen around the Ukraine conflict, that just smacks you right in the face.
The connection between the Israeli people and the American people is bone deep. It's bone deep. Generation after generation, that connection grows. We invest in each other. We dream together. We're part of what has always been the objective we both had.
And it's the irony, too, of having this transition from the Trump administration, which by all accounts was almost a blank check for the Netanyahu government. Trump's foreign affairs policy was somewhat chaotic and non-interventionist in a way. The Jerusalem embassy shift happened, the Trump's deal of the century, and then you have this transition to a democratic government led by somebody who is somewhat even more in favor of Israel, a personal friend of Benjamin Netanyahu. There is a kind of cynicism that exists around the U.S. and their relationship with Israel, and their intention and transparency when it comes to the idea of them really, for the last few decades, being the primary broker of peace between these two parties. Has that, as it stands today, but also over the last couple of decades, is that cynicism around that relationship warranted? And is there really an intention to change this relationship when it comes to successive U.S. administrations?
The reality of American politics is Israel has a blank check. The last time there was a serious pushback, not an ephemeral, polite suggestion that settlements maybe shouldn't continue, that there was any kind of serious pushback was perhaps in the 90s under Clinton. That's a long time ago. Now, people make the argument Israel would respond very badly to pressure. You'll only encourage the worst tendencies. I think to the extent to which the theory has been tested, actually, when America showed some muscle under the first Bush presidency, a little bit under Clinton, Israelis voted more moderately in the 92 and 99 elections. What we do know is that impunity definitely drives Israel further to the right. So the idea that not holding Israel accountable is somehow going to improve the situation, it's totally blown out the water by a deep record of historical experience. And why wouldn't one expect that to be the case? And this isn't to argue that Israel will be pressured and bullied and sanctioned, and there's a level of sanctions which I think are totally counterproductive. However, what you have is the total opposite end of the spectrum. So you can look at Cuba and the dreadful human cost and the immoral nature of the American policy, and it doesn't do what's written on the tin, right? But you can look at the total opposite end of the spectrum, where you have an ally, massive assistance. Biden spoke about UN Security Council reform because the global South is like, we're not taking your BS when it comes to your patronizing stuff around Ukraine. So he speaks about Security Council reform, but more than half of the vetoes that have been used at the Security Council are America, and more than half of the occasions on which that veto has been deployed is protecting Israel against accountability for its illegal actions. Not because it was being singled out. The opposite, it was being treated as a country which violates international law, should be treated, and that's prevented by America. So I don't see a way forward without addressing accountability. Europe is feckless. Are there actors in the global south? Are there coalitions of the like-minded who are ready to step up on this issue? I don't think it's been tested enough. I think the more this issue is thought about, is framed as a question of an anti-apartheid struggle, a settler colonial issue, the more one should be looking to allies in the global south to take some kind of a lead. I think Israel was tremendously boosted in its self-perception of the ability to act with impunity and therefore to go further and act even more egregiously against the Palestinians by the normalization moves. Those were a huge win for the unleashing of we can get away with anything to the levels that it has reached today. So I think one has to look at that and understand that this is not some move towards peace and tolerance. These are acts of self-interest, legitimate from the points of view of the states who are acting in that self-interest, but don't pretend that this is anything other than a blank check for extremist Israeli policies.
So you mentioned this period in history in the 80s and 90s where this kind of idea of progress and reconciliation was at its closest. And that point, I mean, from today, it seems like it's further away than kind of it has been over the last 3 decades. What was that period that you were very much a part of as a negotiator during the Oslo Peace Accords? What was that period like? What was happening? What were those conversations, especially from the Israeli side, and the ideology that was driving it forward that seems so foreign when we're looking at the landscape today?
In retrospect, I can totally understand how a dominant narrative amongst Palestinians and indeed amongst many critics of Oslo is that from the get-go, this was simply a way of reorganizing how one manages the occupation, how one manages Palestinian disenfranchisement. This was disingenuous from the get-go. And it may well be that key actors in that space came with that intention. I'm not quite so deterministic in how I look at it. I think there were other processes going on globally at the time. Northern Ireland, South Africa, they're in a very different place today, with all the shortcomings of post-apartheid South Africa, yet we are in post-apartheid South Africa. And remember, this begins at the back end of the First Intifada. It's the reaction to the First Intifada. It's a mobilization of effective Palestinian ground-level resistance. And I think Israel felt it had to adapt, respond. For all the legitimate criticism of Rabin, I think it's meaningful that Rabin in 1992 forms a governing bloc after the election where, in order to secure his governance, he relies on the support and an agreement with the then 5 members of Knesset, non-Zionist, representing the Palestinian citizens of Israel, is put onto the roster of the parliament at the beginning of the formation of a government, of which they are not members, but there's an agreement for external support. And he speaks in the parliament when he's introducing his new government and says we cannot always see the world as something that is out to get us. I'm paraphrasing, as we are this kind of lonely island. Had a strong Palestinian national movement have been able to maneuver that differently, Israel's now in this process. How do you work within that process? Had the other thing we've talked about, had Israel's feet been held to the fire over its behavior during that process? And the premise is Palestinian reasonableness, I think for Palestinian critics at the time, excessive reasonableness and excessive denigration of for instance, the needs of the refugee community. But the premise was Palestinian reasonableness, an Israeli understanding that this can't continue, we're going to have to make some gives, and international prodding and pushing to get it over the line that could generate something different. It doesn't happen. Part of it is that the internationals are not there to hold Israel's feet to the fire. I do think that the Oslo structures are no longer, I mean, of course they're not fit for purpose. Of course this is not going to deliver an outcome. Partition itself is probably a relic of that era. But I actually think even the ability to pretend, even the make-believe that there's an Oslo architecture that the international community can at least still play with, I think that is in its denouement. Largely because A, Israel has so clearly moved on from that, and B, the Palestinian Authority so obviously does not serve the interests of the Palestinians. Does not challenge Palestinian disenfranchisement and denial of rights. It is so divorced from deriving its credibility, its legitimacy from the Palestinian people and the struggle of the Palestinian people. So Israel has maneuvered itself into this place where its options are more limited, and it keeps doubling down on a bet. The bet it keeps doubling down on is we can control the Palestinians enough that they cannot develop an effective freedom struggle. Palestinians will decide what the nature of that freedom struggle is, what the realization of their rights looks like, what the demand for that looks like. If and when that day comes, the ability to defend this internationally in the face of an effective, strategic, attractive struggle for freedom, I think will be very challenging for Israel and for its supporters. Rallying round a government that includes Gvir and Smotrich, they'll do it, sadly, but it will be difficult. But you combine that overreach with the effective counter-struggle, that's when we're in new terrain. And by the way, I fully expect America and the West to be the latecomers to a movement for freedom that is gaining support globally. They were the latecomers on South Africa. The ANC was still a listed terror organization once Mandela was out of prison and in the president's office. So, perhaps, it's really important to work in the US, to work in the West. Let's at least limit the damage they're doing. But perhaps we need to be looking for allies elsewhere amongst forces who understand what it looks like to decolonize, what a struggle for freedom looks like.
Fantastic. Daniel Levy, thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you,
us today and for sharing your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.